Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. When you're ready to launch your next project, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so you should check out Linode at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for running your awesome app or experimenting with a project that you hear about on the show. You can visit our site at www.podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And to help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes or Google Play Music and tell your friends and coworkers. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Dwayne Bailey and Ryan Northey about Translate House and the process of internationalization and localization for software projects. So, Dwayne, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Dwayne. I'm a South African who develops on Poodle, which is part of the Translate House tools. And that's me.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ryan. I'm currently the lead developer at Translate House. Work closely with Dwayne and work with lots of different software projects to localize their products.
And how did you each get introduced to Python? Dwayne, how about you go first?
So the date's 1996. I was doing some work on a online newspaper, had to hack up some of their code. And it's the first time I hit Python. I was completely intrigued by space indenting. And at the top of all the files was a copyright header that said Mark Shuttleworth. So it was probably his first code before he went on to found Thought and then Ubuntu.
And how about you, Ryan?
I've been working for an organization called Community Technology, and we've been mostly using PHP, various other kind of early web technologies. I think this was the late 90s. And we really started to use Linux, and I started looking for a language that allowed me to sysadmin tasks more. As things progressed, PHP became not quite so secure and so on. So gradually I moved most of my web projects over to Python as well.
And how did you each get involved in localization?
So my thing was, in South Africa we have 11 official languages. So I was just fascinated. I'm a passionate open source person. I was quite intrigued, could we use open source to address a language need in the country on a technology platform? And I just started investigating how to localize, and that's kind of how I got involved. So I was first really trying to localize into local languages. That eventually grew. We ran things across Africa. And then the tools kind of came out of that, which was developing tools for serious problems or missing things in the ecospace. But ultimately it was about helping people have computers in their language so that they could actually be part of the digital age.
And how about you, Ryan?
Well, my background was in anthropology. Via a strange route, I got into coding and became very inspired by open source software. In truth, I haven't got anything like the kind of experience that Dwayne has in the localization field. But my goal really has been about increasing participation in the web. And thankfully met Dwayne and found out what Translate House have been doing over that time, and I've got more and more involved in localization, and it seems like a great vehicle to increasing that diversity and participation in the web.
So for people who aren't familiar with it, how would you describe the difference between internationalization and localization? And I'm also wondering if there are any cases where it would make sense to only do one of those things, or if they're just different words for the same thing.
Well, they're definitely not different words for the same thing. They are kind of in the industry parlance, they're seen as two different things. The easiest way I found to think about it is internationalization is the things that you need to do to your software to make it possible to localize it. So the simple things like, well, they're not necessarily simple, but things like if you were going to display a date, if it's internationalized, you would be allowing that date to be displayed differently. It's kind of, you could think of it as mostly as a once-off thing. Localization is then actually making that piece of software work in another language. So if I wanted to do it, to run the software in Afrikaans, I would be needing to then define how dates work in Afrikaans and do the actual translation. And that's the process of localization, and that you could think of as the ongoing process. As you add a new language, you repeat the same steps, and as the software gets updated, you re-update the translations. So internationalization is the kind of make it possible. Localization is actually the doing it. The kind of two interweave. So you definitely can't do localization without internationalization. If you're going to do anything, you should internationalize. And I think my big thing for people who are looking at it is you better move quickly from looking at to actually doing it, because if you leave it late in your design process or your implementation, it becomes really difficult to implement. So if you haven't thought internationalization, you've probably hard-coded dates and layouts and all that, assuming certain things. So you kind of want to do it early, even if you aren't actually delivering it in other languages. So you do need to do internationalization first. But ultimately, the best internationalization comes from the kind of feedback that localizers give you to say, oh, this actually doesn't work in our language.
Following up on what Dwayne said, I think there's also a difference on a human level in the sense that internationalization is something that's much more done in terms of the software, whereas localization is at least in our work, has been much more working with localization teams to get the knowledge about their languages and how to best represent things within their language, and getting that back into the internationalization process in a sense.
So for people who are starting a new project, or also people who already have an existing project, are there cases where it doesn't make sense to do the internationalization step followed by localization? Or is it something that, in your opinion at least, everybody should be doing from the get-go?
You're asking localizers if localization should be optional. I mean, my thing is, every case where I've met people who say, oh, we don't really need this, like either they don't have a market or they don't see a market. And when you change the paradigm slightly, like let's do community localization, where the cost of actually doing the translation is not necessarily something borne in monetary terms. If they haven't done any of those processes before, they can't really leverage that. I mean, I literally can't think, maybe software that's on the Mars rover is something you don't want to localize.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if for example, there is some software that's specifically designed for a particular language and so on. But I would say that's probably not the best approach overall. And I say that the internet has just meant the need to localize has now cut across many different types of software. And when we really see our community growing, both from one end, big corporates, to the other end, guys sitting in his bedroom developing games and so on. So I think the need to localize or the opportunities presented by localizing have really opened up to a much bigger group now. And so I can't think off the top of my head either, really, where I would suggest or advise to someone that they should not bother doing that.
So for anybody where the software that they're building is actually going to be used by end consumers for whatever definition of consumer, then internationalization and localization are definitely worthwhile endeavors.
Yeah, definitely. And I think compared to when I started this, the platforms and the processes from the internationalization side are just much, much better. And so it's not a lot of work that they need to do. If they're targeting certain platforms, like if they were targeting mobiles and all that, even the move in the last few years in terms of what's possible. You used to have struggle with things like on an iPhone, you were limited to languages that Apple kind of had approved, and now you kind of have much more freedom to do any language. So the freedoms that are enjoyed now are much bigger than kind of when we started. So there's really very little reason at the moment not to.
I think the big blocker to someone adopting those processes really is how much overhead they need to learn and how much they need to adapt their process to do that. And I think that's more applicable in the sense of internationalization, because you don't necessarily want to make localizing to loads of target languages that you're not necessarily going to use your immediate goal. But building the internationalization into your software processes early on will offer a huge amount of benefit down the road as and when that becomes important.
And I think from our side as well, like we're very passionate about languages, and they're not very good words for them, but often people will talk about minority languages, but we are talking about minority languages of 100 million speakers. So the opportunity of those markets is amazing. And I think we looked at stuff where we say, well, how do we make it possible for people to make it relatively easy to onboard a language like that? Because I think the very traditional model of the 10, 20 years ago is very costly to add each new language. And I think it's not as costly, but there are process costs and engagement costs. And I think some of our tooling is really built around how do you make that almost a zero cost to an organization. So it would be easy to say, someone arrived and said, oh, I want to translate your product into Hindi, that you could just say, go for it. We've got the processes and platform, and we're not worried about the cost to us of actually delivering that. And I think that's where we feel like we're hitting a measure of success, where we're achieving our social objectives of getting more languages translated, but we're also doing that by making it easier for software developers.
So I think there's also a dimension to this in terms of open source software development, and I think it really benefits communities. It's, as we work more and more with different localization teams, they're quite often, let's say there's a big overlap between the local open source guys, the people who are contributing to other projects anyway. And so there's a huge amount of benefit to open source projects in trying to engage localization communities to build their contribution and their user base and so on, their developers base.
So you both work for an organization called Translate House that's focused on localizing and internationalizing software projects, and you have a number of projects that are contained under that organization. So I'm wondering if you can briefly introduce each of them and describe their purpose and how they relate to each other.
So the tools that we've developed, really each one of them has emerged out of a need that we had within our own communities and that we saw in the localization space. The primary one is a Pootle, which is a community-based translation platform. So it's a web-based platform that allows people with pretty low technical skills just log in and begin translating. We have the Translate Toolkit, which is really a toolkit that's used by other pieces of software, ours and others, to provide format support for the various localization formats, but also to provide some localization engineering tools that people need. So being able to count words and strings and being able to grep through translation files. The third one is Amagama, which is a translation memory server. So for people not familiar with the terminology in localization, that's just a massive database of previous translations that we're able to try and match close matches. And the last one is Fatal, which is a desktop translation tool. So we were faced with situations where people have really poor connectivity. So how do we deliver a high quality translation tool for low skilled people that don't have connectivity? And that covers the primary four tools that we've developed over a number of years.
And what was the order of creation of those tools?
So it kind of goes the toolkit first. And the primary reason for that is we were localizing various products. We realized we needed to translate a number of things to have an impact for a language. So some of the key targets were things like Mozilla and OpenOffice at the time, but we were translating KDE and GNOME and some of Red Hat. And so we had some pretty good tools for translating PO files, one of the formats in open source, but Mozilla and OpenOffice brought a number of formats. Mozilla about 4 or 5 formats, and OpenOffice a really strange thing that just looked like a massive spreadsheet. And there were no tools to translate those. So our first task was, well, could we convert these strange formats into PO so we could use great tools and we could consolidate them? And that's really why we built the toolkit first. Pootle we then built for the problem of trying to, we just struggled to install software on people's computers. Some of the translators would be translating from work where they weren't allowed to install software, and the web just provided a really easy paradigm. We run translate-a-thons with some communities sometimes, and in one instance we had 1,000 people translating in Uganda. So being able to do a web-based tool that you could just deploy very quickly made it possible to just get people translating as fast as we could. And then Amagama and Fatal came after that.
Yeah, I don't have a huge amount to add to what Dwayne said. I think our focus now is probably worth mentioning. Our focus now is mostly around Pootle because it allows us to build communities around localization and beyond the challenges of the software itself. The mission for us really is localization. So the best platform for reaching people is, I think, the web to do that.
And one thing that I was thinking of as you were describing your work on Amagama is that in a lot of languages, the context matters to determine what the appropriate translation would be. So I'm wondering how you managed to be able to capture that, or if it's largely just a sort of word-for-word translation where you have seen this particular word or phrase before and then you offer up the translated version in the language that the translator is working in.
So maybe just clearing up it so people don't get confused with what it does. So it's not doing machine translation at all. So it is just looking for, you've got a string that you've seen before. Could be a phrase, could be a single word. If it's a single word in a menu or it's a sentence in some help text. And we're looking for that in the database. So we're just doing edit distance matching or other techniques to try to find a close match. And that's kind of the technique. So we don't really solve the context problem. So I think there are things we'd love to do in Amagama that will help solve that. But the context problem for people that don't necessarily know other languages is certain languages, English for one, the noun and the verb are the same word. Open would That's not a very good example, but where the same word in English is a verb or a noun in another language. So finding a match for open in English, because what we're doing is we're finding an English match and finding your translation that relates to that. So it doesn't necessarily solve that problem. But where it's really helpful is sometimes it's just difficult for new translators certainly, to figure out what the word should be. Very new languages are often having to coin a lot of words. So it's a technique to really make it easy for people to translate a little bit faster, and also to be pretty consistent in terms of their translations.
Yeah, I think the consistency would definitely be an important piece as well, because if you've translated it before and then somebody else goes to translate the same word, but they mistakenly add a typographical error, then being able to catch that with a suggestion saying, oh, did you mean this because this is what we already have in our database, then that could potentially catch a certain class of errors.
And you've got I think the other reality, which, it's the same type of problem. So is if other people have translated. So finding the consistent voice between multiple translators. So in open source, where you've got volunteers, that could be a large problem, where you've got teams of even 2 or 3 people would have a different voice or use different words. So it allows that. But even when people are using commercial translators, over time, multiple people will work on the translation. So it is a technique to keep consistency throughout all the products that are being translated.
That kind of relates to terminology, which in some cases people are actually setting the terminology as much as they are finding the terminology, if you like. And so recently we've been working with an organisation in India where in India there's many different languages the government has to support. And even within each of those languages, the same word was being translated in lots of different ways. So what they've done there is create a cross-India project for effectively setting the terminology in different Indian languages so that you can get that consistency across translations.
So what were the motivating factors that caused you to decide that creating an organization to own and support the tools that you were building was the right choice to make?
So I think the interesting thing about the organization is some of our objectives were the things that set up, like putting organization structures in place before we even built tools. So when we were starting work, we weren't developing tools. We were engaging and building localization communities and addressing the localization problem. And part of the organization there was just to be able to engage with governments and with nonprofits as an organization in addressing a problem. And when the tools are born out, it was the perfect vehicle to carry that. So having an organization has been really helpful to do that. The tools themselves, the licensing of them is actually within a non-profit organization. So we as an organization are really passionate about the open source nature of the tools that we develop. And we've seen in the space, some open source tools go proprietary. And it's quite critical for us to remain steadfast on kind of keeping these tools open source, mostly because we need great tools for language communities that need the services. So that's been built into the organization we've developed. And the other realization, which came a little bit later, is maybe a little bit of frustration. We built a great tool, people started using it, people would reject it because it didn't do something, but we never really heard about that. And so it was really a vehicle to be able to say to people, look, you've got this feature, you need to integrate it with other tools. Like the people who are developing these tools are available to engage commercially to actually address this. Some large organizations are using platforms like Poodle, and for them it's about how do we ensure the sustainability of the software and how do we engage in terms of business continuity. So just some of it is not just support that they need, they just need to know that the software that they've invested in, and some of them have built some pretty sophisticated localization processes, they need to make sure that the software continues. And so it's been an amazing vehicle for us then to be able to communicate that we do support this stuff professionally, and we've got vehicles to do that, but still remain as a proudly open source piece of software.
And the organization that you run is, if I understand correctly, a distributed one. So I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that you face in managing an organization of that structure?
Well, Ryan suffers from most of it. So.
Well, I think we've learned quite a lot of lessons over the last couple of years and gradually built more collaborative processes. We are widely distributed. Our core developers are distributed across Russia, Spain, UK, South Africa. We also kind of travel quite a lot for one thing or another. So we really have to be able to work in a kind of very distributed way. We tend to use either open source or open source focused platforms for doing that. We obviously use GitHub a lot, and I think that's been pretty critical to our development process, and also allowing us to communicate with the wider community, because beyond the core devs, there's quite a lot of contributors, both long term and people who dive in just because they want to solve a particular problem. As a core team, we have daily scrums. I think that's really critical to our process. We are all working pretty much on our own in our own environments and so on. In terms of focus, it can get kind of lonely if you're not having those opportunities to talk through the things that you've done and what you hope to do, from there. So I think that's a pretty critical part of our process, beyond the software.
We also try, because I think we don't necessarily have face-to-face communication, so that can be a little problematic. So one of the things we try to do is get together half yearly or every quarter, just to have face-to-face with us as a team, and either do that as a sprint or just try to work through more complex problems. So we haven't been able to avoid the fact that we do need to get together. Time zones can be a little bit of a problem when we're working together, but we kind of sync around UK time. So we have, I think some of the things I've struggled with is we have had times where we've had developers in Australia, and that proved quite difficult. So the time zone shifting thing is not something that I think you can completely solve in the kind of process we followed. We're pretty successful at making it work, but it is very different if you're trying to look at some stuff like agile development. Most of the stuff written requires face-to-face in the same room type stuff, and trying to replicate that or find models that allow some of that to work for us has been trial and error and experimental.
But I think that in part the tools have improved, and in part we've kind of learned better processes. So we tend to sort of jump in and pair program together, and whenever there's a problem where two heads would be better than one, and combining that with voice communication. We all know each other pretty well, I think it's fair to say, even if we're not having as regular contact. But at the same time, I think as Dwayne said, nothing really does substitute for co-locating. And so, again, this is something we're sort of learning the best ways to approach it, but particularly around either conferences or other kind of meetings that we have to do. We're trying to sort of build in time to spend with each other, as a core team.
Yeah, the whole concept of distributed work and distributed organizations is definitely something that has been around for a little while, but it's still evolving in terms of the appropriate norms and methodologies for making it work. And of course, every team is different, so it's kind of hard to build up a sort of community knowledge of how best to approach these kinds of problems because of the fact that there are so many human factors involved. But I think it'll be interesting to see how this general trend of work environment continues to evolve in the coming years.
Yeah, definitely.
I think with there's mostly we've answered in terms of our core team, but I think part of what we'd really like to do and the challenges that we really face right now is to build that community of localizers, especially around not necessarily around a particular open source or free software product, but around the open source and free software community. So as localization needs arise, there is already a kind of body of people there that are able to address those. And I think part of that's about learning what's in it for localizers and beyond their desire to see software in their own language. It's about working with young people and working out, how this gives them career opportunities, or how this gives them a community, or how this allows them to interact in ways beyond their immediate environment. So I think there's an answer to this about how do we as an open source and free software community, how do we build localization into our collaborative processes more generally.
And I think the stuff that I picked up on just from listening to Ryan was that we want to be distributed because we want to include voices from other people. And I think my own story is a really critical thing of why other voices are important. If you understand languages in our context of South Africa, mostly European languages are call them monolingual in a country. You speak French in France, German in Germany. And so people were tackling problems as if languages were that kind of geographically located. And they're also pretty mature. and they hadn't really dealt with a language team that was dealing with 10 languages. So we would do strange things, like we had to do some of the basic internationalization stuff, but it was really painful to do it 10 times. Because you realize most of those other teams had experienced someone had experienced some pain at some time, but it hadn't been worth them documenting it, because once the pain was gone, it was gone. They hadn't needed to build any tools. So some of our tooling was to address our own problem. And I think that voice needed to be heard. And I have a friend who calls it blowback localization. So Pootle is developed in Africa to address an African need, but then is globally useful. So all the people who are benefiting it from now are actually benefiting it because an African group needed to address a problem. So I think that the importance of those other voices is critical for what we want to do.
And on a somewhat technical level, for projects that are in the process of translating the source text and doing the localization process, when you only have a partial translation completed, is that something, would you start exposing those localized strings as they are produced, or is it something where you would want to wait until either a critical amount or the totality of the text has been translated before you actually expose it for the end user?
So, I mean, the kind of my input there would be, it really does depend. It's like, what is the piece of software? How have you structured stuff? So you can structure things to say, well, let's make sure we translate the most critical things that everyone's going to see first. Because I think if you look at it's that a kind of 80-20 rule, 20% of the UI is all you need to do, because most people don't need to know all the variants of blowfish encryption and all, it's somewhere in your app. So if you can prioritize important things first, you can get away with very little translation, but that means that you have to be able to do that in your localization platform or in the tooling. My thing as well is I weigh it up in terms of the language and the community. It's much, much more important that the community is rewarded for the work that they do. So if it's a friend and his mates, there are 10 of them, like, just get it out there early so that they can brag and build their community. Because that hampered some of our work, is that people wouldn't really let us release software because we needed to build a community. So we were like, but we want to use your software to build our community. And there are only 5 COSA users, and there probably will be 10 in a week or two's time, and in a year there'll be 100. So the damage is pretty minimal. So my general feeling is there's some point it will depend on your software. 80% rule is probably a good one if you want to suck it out of a thumb. If the people are at 80%, they're mostly done. And the other thing I would say, if you want some sense of confidence, is if the translator is actually using the software on a daily basis, which might seem like a strange thing, but there are a lot of people who will translate stuff they don't use. But if you had someone translating VLC and they actually watch all their videos on VLC, everything that needs to be translated will be translated. So you can kind of be assured of that. So those are kind of 2 things.
I would say that question probably would get answered differently in the free and open source communities as it would perhaps in the corporate. I think in the free and open source communities, really localizers want to see their localization into production and in the software as quickly as possible. And just in terms of that reward cycle, I think it's really important to get it, even partially translated up and out there. I think in the corporate world, where they're much more concerned about how their voice comes through in any particular localization, they probably want a tighter review schedule to make sure that any localization that goes into their product is reflecting their voice in that language. And I think that's quite a big challenge. You have to trust your localizers really to tell you whether or not the localization is reflecting your voice if you don't speak that language. And so it's a slightly different process, I think, in the sort of corporate world than it is in the community world.
Also in the corporate world, though, you'll often have people commissioned to do certain translations, so you will get 100% translated. But I think corporates will all discover that even paid translation is not necessarily good translation. It does get done, and if you choose well, you can kind of work out how to guarantee that. But I think your metrics will be slightly different if you're paying for translation. But even Microsoft doesn't translate everything, so yeah. There's some point at which you make decisions.
Yeah,
in
many
reduce
respects,
the amount of content.
In many respects, and I think that really that's where the free and open source community really does have some advantages. Is that we can get localization, we can build localization communities in a way that we don't have to and worry about corporate voice. We can reflect global voice instead.
Yeah. Well, I think one part of the narrative in terms of where we sit at the moment in terms of localization generally for minority and marginal languages is that some of the changes in terms of Microsoft translating much more stuff was actually precipitated by people translating free and open source software. So it set a precedent of needing to translate. And so it's led to much, much more being translated. So Google and Microsoft are pretty well translated to quite a lot of languages nowadays. Whereas 15 years ago, a company that translated a lot of languages would do 35, and mostly you could get away with doing 15 would be quite a good one. And I think people are doing many, many more languages and big products now.
Yeah, and I'm sure that part of that too is driven by the increasing globalization of industry and just communication in general, because the internet has been able to reach more places as we build out other methods for actually creating that interconnect, because before everything was hardwired landlines, and now that as we're developing more wireless technologies that make it easier and cheaper to bring the internet into more rural and undeveloped areas, it brings more people online and increases the need for them to be able to actually interact with the content that people are producing.
Sure. When we kind of started this and looked at mobile didn't exist in the form that it does now, we'd have long debates about the value of translating and whether people in rural areas even needed it or could even access it. And that kind of debate just became moot when everyone has a mobile phone. And not everyone is on the internet. We mustn't pretend about some of the realities of that. But suddenly, should I translate this phone into this language is a question of, do you want to sell more minutes? And that I met some Indian cell phone providers who tackled the problem like that said we could make a lot of money if we could sell really cheap calls to lots of people. And the only way we could get lots of people is that having a Hindi phone was not optional. It was the only thing that they could do, and it had to be cheap. So the mobile space, I think, has changed radically the way we think about what should be translated and who will consume.
Yeah. And in itself, I think it's the point you alluded to is it has a hugely transformative nature, including so many more people into that global conversation. And I think the goal for us as an organisation is how do we make the internet reflect those voices better?
So at the technical level of the actual translation apparatus itself, I know that there are a number of different standards and formats for being able to actually encode the various translations into the source code that you're working with. So I'm wondering, what are some of the architectural and design challenges that have arisen in your work with the Translate Toolkit to be able to provide an abstraction over the top of all of those various systems?
TTK is certainly developed a little bit slower because we've got a wider community of users and it's used at a lower level. So we have to be very careful when we make changes to make sure that it remains compatible and we're making the right changes and so on. I mean, historically, I think, as you said, there's been a lot of challenges in terms of supporting multiple encodings and working with, not only different formats and not necessarily well-specified formats, but formats that people have kind of adapted themselves to kind of meet their own needs. So TTK has kind of grown quite organically over the years to meet those various needs. Internally, it tends to represent different formats in a Poe-like way, Poe's the kind of get text standard, and it's been pretty robust. It doesn't necessarily cover all use cases, but like other standards, it's kind of been adapted and overloaded, if you like, to kind of meet different people's needs. So internally, TTK represents pretty much everything in a kind of Poe-like way, and that allows it to do things such as diffing and kind of comparing different files. Python 3 is obviously a factor here. It's kind of making the encoding more standard and making Unicode more standard.
Yeah, I think the one funny thing to think about with TTK is that if you leave a bunch of programmers in a room, usually they have no localization experience. They will invent a new localization format.
It's like the XKCD cartoon, there's already 15 formats. We need one that will encompass them all. There's now 16 formats. I think one of the things we've also been looking at around that is, I think that taking a step back and what are really the priorities there. And I think compatibility is a priority, portability is a priority, but I think brevity is also a priority. We looked at XLIF quite a bit and whether or not that's a good way to internally represent the different formats. I think it possibly is because it's very extensible, so we can kind of make it without having to do anything outside of the spec, if you like. We can make it meet or to cover all of those different formats. I think it also provides a way of having data portability, and obviously you can use kind of XML tools and what have you to do comparison and diffing and so on. I think where it falls down a little bit is obviously the kind of classic problem with XML, that it tends to be a little bit data heavy. So even for a small amount of information, you end up with quite a large file, which is not quite as portable as one might hope. But we haven't entirely decided our kind of roadmap in that sense, but I think we would like to move towards a format that is more extensible by design than Poe is, because Poe has kind of served us so well up until now. For now, that's the kind of internal standard that we tend to use.
I think it's almost strange being an organisation that I don't think we anticipated that we would have to maintain a library of formats, and so kind of ensuring stability and testing that has been really interesting, and learning those kind of skills.
So bringing it up a level to the Pootle and Vertol tools, I'm wondering how they compare feature-wise to some of the other offerings for web or desktop-based translation. And I'm also curious if they're primarily used for translating text in the context of software, or do you see them get used for other sources of text as well, such as maybe print media?
So picking up on the first question, when Dwayne first out developing Pootle, there really wasn't much in terms of other open source options for localization, and localization tended therefore to be done by hand. So Pootle was kind of a really critical play at that point. And one thing that's been, we've actually found really healthy is that there's now more and more tools available for localization. Thankfully, quite a few of those are also open source. In terms of features and so on, there's quite a few different platforms, so it's kind of hard to go into specific features and platforms and so on. I think for us, our kind of focus is very much on localizers. So our platform is very much set up so that if you need to translate a large number of strings, you can go through them very quickly. And, certainly our aspiration is, if you're a complete novice localizer and don't really know much about localization and formats and what goes on in the back end and so on, it's also really easy for you to do that. So I think for us, it's about working with those communities, working with communities that are building, for example, their own machine translation, and finding out how we can incorporate that. In that respect, I'd say our strength is our community, really.
Well, I think from a feature perspective, I think we tick all the boxes in terms of what's needed in a localization tool. I think the one critical thing for us is that we've really worked, and we think quite a lot around how do we put great localization technology, so the things that like TM and MT and terminology.
TM is translation memory, and MT is machine translation.
Well, I kind of wanted to not divide them, because specifically we want to put that in people's hands without them needing to know what they are and what they mean and how they work. So maybe a simple example would be when someone gives you a TM match, they'll give you a percentage match. Like, who knows and who cares what that means? I know what it means. I don't think it means anything to anyone else. So we kind of don't show those kind of things so we weigh up, in terms of translators, how do we get really great technology that the industry would use into their hands without them necessarily needing to be experts in the tools. And so when we stack up the features like that, we have the features that people need in terms of localization.
We've also got a pretty healthy checks framework, I think. Beyond human reviews, it allows a certain amount of checking and flagging up when there's issues. And I think that's really feeds into one of the future goals that we have, is how do we apply continuous integration, as has been quite successful for us as a community and as a project. How do we kind of apply that into the localization context itself? I think that's an area we're really looking at. How do we improve those check systems? How do we make it easier for people to write checks specific to their language or their project? And how do we find ways to integrate those checks frameworks into other continuous integration processes?
So do you see the Pootle and Vertol tools used outside of the context of software at all?
Yeah, we do. As kind of localization purists, we kind of think, well, these tools, we did design them for software translation. They're not necessarily used. We know the limitations in other spaces, but everyone we meet who uses it almost invariably is translating other stuff. So they're translating web content, or they're translating documents that they've processed and loaded up. So anything that you could break down into sentences, you could get into Pootle, and people do that. So So part of that is the step before, using the Translate Toolkit or other processes. But we see many people who are starting with translating their software and very quickly realizing they want to translate other things. So they're loading other content into their Poodle service and doing that.
One of our key areas of development has been VCS integration, and in doing that, we've tried to make a very generic adapter so that Poodle can consume and produce data for different back-end file systems. I think in doing that, we've kind of seen the opportunities that we might be able to hook that into other potentially database or content stores. So I think that's an area we'd really like to push things further, because it's how the tool's used, not necessarily how the tool was designed.
And is there room for integration with some of the natural language processing or machine learning systems for being able to actually do some of the things like word stemming, so that you can take a particular translation and then be able to extrapolate some of the other potential word tenses for maybe bringing it into a different context, particularly in the case of the translation memory system?
I think there's a huge potential for that.
It's massive.
Reminded me a little bit of watching DJs going from vinyl to digital, if you like. Initially, when I got involved in localization, there was a huge amount of pushback to machine translation because it was seen as being of low quality and not as good as what a human could produce. I think that technology in itself has transformed just in the last couple of years, and I think there's now a lot more buy-in, not necessarily to automate translation per se, because you're not necessarily going to get the voice. If you want to reflect a particular voice in a culture and so on, you kind of need to understand the message on a slightly deeper level than a pure translation. But certainly in terms of, at this time at least, certainly in terms of as an aid to localizers. But I think that's a space that's likely to really push forward. An interesting project we did a year or so ago was a professor in the US who translates in a couple of different Gaelic languages, and the languages are very, very closely related. And so really what he wanted to do was to be able to translate one language and then machine translate from one of those to the other, because it's almost systematic. And so we integrated that into Poodle, and that's kind of really sped up his process of localization. But it would be really good to see that applied, not just to the kind of headline big European or Indic languages or Asian languages, but also to some of those smaller languages, because they're at risk of dying out or don't necessarily have such good support already. So I think getting a body of translation into machine learning could benefit those languages as well. So that's something we'd really like to look at. And if there's anyone who wants to kind of fund us to do some some proper research into that would be amazing. But for now, it's where we can find collaboration really to bring those skills to our project.
I think if we look at the last year with Poodle, we spent a lot of our time just cleaning up code and abstracting things and making things pluggable. Well, the machine translation integration is pluggable. We'd love to make it more pluggable. The translation memories is pluggable. Checks will become pluggable. So I think we feel there's a ton of scope to allow people to adapt things. I mean, even we could do much more with translation memory by doing, they call it in-context exact matching, where the string matches. It matches better if it's the string before and the string after match, and it might address the context issue you talked about. But even doing, I think your kind of question talked a little bit about stemming, but it's even doing that. So it's finding a word, stemming it, or figuring it out that actually the English is using the verb, so we actually are going to suggest the verb terminology for you. There's a ton that we'd love to see happening there. So that's really exciting for us to empower language communities really to be able to drive some of that and integrate tools and integrate stuff like that. So it feels like, I think from our side, because we do focus so much on the teams, is that a lot of focus on localization tools is about the program. It's like, how do we integrate with your version control system and your software, which is important. But I think we feel like there's a lot of power that we're missing by just not empowering the teams that are going to come to translate your software well. And so we'd love to see more happening there.
And on the language front, what are some of the complexities or difficulties that are introduced by needing to support a language, needing to be able to support an additional language that isn't already covered by the tools that you're developing?
Pretty much no work, really. I mean, there are some technical things that a new language that comes in needs to do, but bless the Unicode consortium, because they solved one of the biggest problems that really used to stymie languages, that they couldn't represent their characters and they didn't have fonts. So some of the big problems that we have traditionally hit, and a lot of them been eliminated. So Unicode has eliminated one of the biggest problems, so that is not too much of a problem for new languages. New languages face things like font issues, but that's been pretty well addressed now by Google and Microsoft in making universally available fonts that cover a lot of characters. But that is a language that minority languages an issue that minority languages will hit, that they can write their text, but they can't actually see it on the screen, and they can't see it on the internet. And then there are other, like, deeper things that languages need to start tackling with some software things. So kind of the good software localization frameworks will have concepts of plural forms. So there are one file to downloading, and there's two files downloading, that kind of plural. And in Arabic, there's 6 forms, in Russian, I think there are 3. And so you translate it differently depending what that number is. So some of those languages that don't have that defined need to define the algorithm or the equation that just determines which form you're going to use.
There are standards around that as well.
And there's standards. So even Unicode has emerged the CLDR, which is the Common Locale Data Repository, and that's storing a lot of stuff. How do you write dates? So those are the things that a new language would have to do. How do you write dates in times in your language? What number systems do you use? What calendar systems? But, we're in a very different space these days where you'd basically have to be quite a small minority language that hadn't been localized into anything to still have to tackle those. So the things that we would face on Poodle are minimal, like we don't have to do very much to get a team translating anymore. Databases cover their language and all that.
But answering that question in the context of somebody wanting to see more free and open source software localized to their language, I think the answer is probably more of a community thing. It's about knowing where to go and translate things. And I think one of the things we'd like to see is a slightly easier process for somebody who wants to set about translating their language. At the moment, you would have to go to quite a lot of different places and engage with the localization groups within those projects in order to get that done. And what would be quite nice is if there was a place where people could engage with lots of open source projects at the same time.
So I think I answered the question in some way, which was looking at it from our perspective and from the software perspective. But if you look at it from a language team's perspective, if they've never translated anything, one of their serious hurdles is they will have no terms for a lot of computer terminology. So the terms might exist, they need to collect them, or they might need to repurpose them, following very similar ways that language develops new terms anyway. It adapts words, reuses words, or creates new words. So that's usually for a new team is one of their biggest hurdles, is learning how to localize and then building the missing terminology and using it. So building a terminology base is one of their biggest hurdles.
And in terms of the distribution of your software, when you have a web-based presence, it's fairly simple to tell people how to access it. You just go to a particular website and maybe go through the authentication routine. But you also have your desktop project Vertal, which introduces a whole plethora of distribution issues in terms of being able to get it on somebody's computer and make sure that it's running effectively. So I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that you've had to overcome in the process of packaging and distribute, in terms of solving the packaging and deployment aspects of getting Vertal out to people who are trying to use it?
I would just quickly pick up that in terms of Poodle, we do release it for different platforms. So we still have some of those challenges in terms of supporting a different ecosystem for that software to be deployed. But I think you're right that the challenges in terms of Vertal, and Dwayne can probably talk about.
Well, the challenges are pretty big, which is why we haven't released it for a long time. So, I mean, Vertal is one of my favorite pieces of software, but it's just we haven't had the time or resources to really develop it. It's been fun watching other people take some of its ideas and implement it in theirs. So some of the biggest problems we faced was, and some of them do relate to Python and some of our choices in terms of GUI Toolkit. So we use GTK, and that has been one of our hardest parts in terms of distributing, is just how do you package it on Windows and Mac. So there's documentation and processes. It's never as clear as it is on Linux about how you do it. And so packaging that has been really difficult. GTK went through 2 to 3 migration, and we've never made it to 3 because that transition was difficult. So the biggest hurdles we found in terms of distributing was it's really difficult. Well, it's not difficult to do it, but it's quite a process. There was a lot of engineering and time to get the first Mac version out, but then there was the feeling of it took us quite a lot of work to make it feel like it really belonged on a Mac platform. So GTK, at the time we were doing it, just always felt a little bit like it didn't belong. So packaging up GTK, compiling it, making sure that you've got a deployable app, it's quite difficult from the Python perspective. They make pretty nice packages that you've got everything there and it all works, but that was quite a process. So we have a luxury in terms of Linux and that other people end up packaging it for you. But having to package it was difficult. And that was the hardest part, was just, being able to build packages, getting it up on the website, getting people to download it was less of an issue. And so we really have struggled just to recreate those engineering skills to rebuild and automate that. So
and in that time, the web technology's really moved on. Yeah. And so I think the question we ask ourselves is, do we want to put that time into a desktop piece of software where really people are much more reluctant now to install a desktop piece of software and much more inclined towards using the web. And so the question really is, can we use the web to address the issues that Vital was addressing in terms of offline usage? I mean, it's not something we've really successfully conquered so far, but it's certainly something we've actively discussed.
Yeah, and I think some of what we want to do with Pootle in terms of like using WebSockets and that would put us in a very different paradigm for the editor, like the Pootle translation editor, and say, well, could we take this offline? And when we can take it offline, are we addressing kind of the core need of why we wrote Vital, which was people with no connectivity. So we were dealing with people who would have to drive to an internet cafe, download files, go translate them at home, and we might be able to tackle that by just doing Pootle a bit differently. So it's not the most positive story for releasing desktop software written in Python.
But we've got to best use our limited resources in terms of our development time, and I think really there's so much more reach with web technologies than there is with desktop technology. So it's kind of been more of our focus, if we're honest.
We do love to tell people that we accept pull requests and we love community contributions. So in terms of Vital, I know we've got people who are still using, they love using it. If we can entice people out of the community who are willing to just spend a little bit of time figuring out how to package on Windows now, and we know how to package on Mac, it's just the time that's involved in putting it all together and really automating it, then we're probably in a position to do that again. So it's kind of an appeal to the wider community if you're passionate about GTK or Python on the desktop, or Python on platforms like Windows and Mac. We'd love to hear from you.
So what are some of the things that you have planned for the future of your projects?
So the last year or so has been really about tightening up, mostly around Pootle, and looking at how we can use, continuous integration processes in Pootle. We've kind of got our test coverage right up, and we've, really addressed a lot of the performance and security issues. So that's been really successful, but it's meant we haven't released, and so we're just about to release an RC version of Pootle. So, I mean, that's quite exciting for us, really. We kind of made the decision some time ago that we didn't want to call something a stable release until we'd addressed really some of the kind of fundamental problems that we were aware of. That's a kind of quite positive story, really, because we've got that out of the way and we're now moving to that release. So I think moving forward, we'd really like to see a more regular release cycle. In terms of actual features, I think we'd like to make better use of newer web technologies. Been working for quite some time on VCS integration, and that's fairly stable now. We're going to package it as part of the release, although there's still quite a lot of work needed to be done around that. Improving our format handling, not 100% which direction we'll go with that, but really we've been looking at how we can encompass some of the features that are specific to particular formats in a generic way, and at the same time keep the data that's inside Pootle, make that as portable and as possible. Improving our quality check system, making them more extensible, making it easier for people to write more specific checks. I think there are kind of top line goals really at the moment.
Yeah.
So for people who want to follow what you guys are up to and keep in touch, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Well, the two places are hanging out is if people want to engage with the project, it's our GitHub project at translate/Poodle. And we're on a Gitter channel, gitter.im/translate/Poodle. And they can engage us there.
That's the best place for kind of real-time chat. There's always pretty much, one of us around. If we don't answer straight away, we'll generally answer fairly quickly. And, it's a pretty active community there. So. And
for anybody who wants to follow either or both of you individually, what would be the best way for them to do that? How about you, Dwayne?
I don't know. I really don't.
Okay. GitHub, I would say for myself, github.com /Flax, PHLAX. And if you want to follow what we're up to, if you want to actually speak with us, then the best channel is the Gitter channel.
Okay. So with that, I will move us to the picks. My pick today is going to be the Google Chromecast. I picked one of those up recently because it was on sale for about $10 off the regular price. And my experience so far in using it has been good. There's a little bit of disparity in terms of the support for different apps on my Android tablet, but it's a useful product for being able to easily get something from one screen to a bigger screen for more people to be able to share in viewing it. And I'll be interested to see what other sorts of support and uses it gets put to as they continue to develop that project. So with that, I will pass it to you, Dwayne. What do you have for picks today?
So I struggle because I think I wanted to use this as an opportunity maybe to call out some of the people that we've relied on and loved in terms of the development that we've done.
You're free to do that as well, in addition to any picks that you might have.
Okay, cool. This is just an excuse that I can actually think about what I'm going to pick.
Yep, no, me too. I'm not sure.
One call out is Jitsi, which we use every day for real-time voice and video, which is an open source project developing an equivalent of some of the closed things that we're often engaged with. And so we reliant on them and love them. And mostly we love the fact that every morning we get to see their 4-word random room. So if you ever go to meet.jit.si, they create a 4-word mnemonic for each room, which creates great hilarity every morning.
Yeah, I'd probably go with Gitter if we're going to pick on the basis of what gives us a huge amount of utility. As somebody who used IRC forever, there's a lot of resistance to moving off IRC, and certainly in open source projects because people are so used to it. But I think in reality, HTTP-based messaging offers so many advantages over IRC that it's hard to look back really. And that's become a really core part of our development process, really being able to communicate. And I think the killer feature really is the fact that Gitter allows unlimited rooms, pretty much both public and private, through open source projects. So it allows you to sort of build your community really effectively.
All right. Well, I really appreciate the both of you taking time out of your day to join me and tell me about the work you're doing with Translate House and the projects that you've produced for being able to bring localization and internationalization capabilities to larger communities. Definitely seems like an important thing for everybody to be aware of, and I'll definitely be trying to push more for including those capabilities in the projects that I'm a part of. So I appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Great, thanks so much for having us.
Yep, cheers.